Hello, my name is Dan Morris, and I am on the board of the ABPMP, and I would like to welcome you all to our session today with Bruce Silver. And the session today is BPMN with method and style approach, with the method and style approach, I should say. And I'd like to start off with a few housekeeping notes. First of all, we will be holding the questions to the end, but please send them in at any time during the discussion. We'll hold them, and then at the end we will answer all of them that we can within the time that we have. If people are willing to stay a little longer, we may be able to get to a few more questions. If there are questions that we don't get to, we will have those questions answered, and those questions and the answers will be sent out to the people on the call. In addition, the session today, as with all of our webinars, will be recorded and made available through the ABPMP website to members. I'd like you to please help us out today by keeping your phones on mute. If there are any technical difficulties, hang in there with us. If the line drops, just call back in. And with that, I would now like to introduce Dr. Silver. It's my pleasure to today to open the session with Dr. Silver. Bruce is a principal at both Bruce Silver Associates and at BPM Essentials. And BPM Essentials is a worldwide provider of BPM training and certifications. He served on the technical committee of OMG and has helped develop the BPMN 2.0 specifications. His book, BPMN Methods and Style, is now in its second edition. It's been translated into German, Japanese, and soon Spanish. I haven't personally read the second one, but I read the first book, and I would highly recommend it to anyone who's interested in learning a lot about BPMN and exploring that and how it fits into the overall BPM discipline. He has helped develop numerous tools, method and style approach, including rule validation, a methodology wizard, a BPMN Pro, and gamifications based on e-learning applications. He's also the founder and the co-chair of BPMN Next, which is an annual showcase of the next generation of BPM technologies. He's currently working on a new book, BPMN Methods and Styles. I guess that'll be the third edition, which applies methods and style principles to decision-making modeling standards. Previously to this, Dr. Silver has directed workflow and document management research at BIS Strategic Decisions, and before that was helped with managed software development and marketing for marketing organizations. And he has also served on the board of directors of Captiva Software, which ultimately turned into EMC. He holds a degree in physics from Princeton and MIT, and 4 patents in imaging and workflow technologies. At this point, I would like to turn the session over to Dr. Silver. Dr. Silver, welcome.
Thank you, Dan. Thanks for that introduction. So I'm here today to talk about BPMN, stands for Business Process Modeling Notation, the standard for creating business process diagrams that are used for everything from documenting your as-is process to analyzing it for potential improvement, to modeling an improved to-be process, creating business requirements for some IT implementation, or even automating the end-to-end flow in a BPM suite. The same language, BPMN, can be used for all of these things. So if you're an ABPMP member, I'm sure you've heard of BPMN, and you probably have some position on it, for or against. If you're on this webinar, it's either because you're using BPMN today, but maybe not sure if you're doing it correctly, or else possibly you're determined not to use it. You've heard it's a techie thing, or a vendor thing, or just too complicated. But you do believe in standards, and maybe you're tired of defending your proprietary diagrams, and maybe you're just a little bit curious. So whichever of these applies to you, let me admit something right up front that may make you feel a little better. While there's a lot of BPMN out there today, most of it is not good. It utterly fails in its primary mission, which is to communicate the process logic in a diagram clearly, completely, and of course, correctly according to the BPMN specification. And I'm here today to talk about a way to create good BPMN consistently. So for the next 40 minutes or so, I'm going to be discussing these things. First, what's so special about BPMN? What can it do? And why does so much of the BPMN out there fail to do it? We'll talk about good BPMN, that is, diagrams that actually succeed in their fundamental purpose, and an approach toward doing that consistently called method and style. During the presentation, you can enter your questions on the screen in the Q&A panel, and we'll take them up at the end. All right, so why should you care about BPMN? Isn't it just a swim lane flowchart? BPMN's decision to adopt the basic look of traditional swim lane flowcharts over 10 years ago turned out to be a wise one, because it has succeeded where other process modeling standards did not, which is achieving wide adoption by business users. Some kind of pictorial representation of the process logic is critical to shared understanding. It needs to be intuitive and familiar. And if you want diagrams that bridge the business IT divide, the meaning of the shapes and symbols must also be precisely defined. And BPMN meets both those tests. But I have to say that BPMN's importance today really comes from all the ways in which it is different from traditional swim lane flowcharts. Starting with this one, there is a specification that defines the precise meaning of each shape and symbol, and by extension, a bunch of rules, what can connect to what, and even what a process or an activity really means. That precision is essential to the magic. It's the thing that makes the meaning of the diagram independent of the tool used to create it, and also independent of each modeler's own private semantics, something that we have with traditional flowcharts. But here you already see part of the problem, because BPMN looks like a traditional swim lane flowchart. Many folks, many modelers, think they already know it, and so they don't bother learning those precise meanings and rules. A second difference from traditional flowcharts. BPMN is inherently hierarchical. A sub-process that you see here is simultaneously a single activity and an activity flow from a start event, the thin ring, to some end event, the thick ring. It's defined once in the model, but displayed in both ways in the model, both as a single activity called a collapsive process in one diagram, that's the one with the little plus sign, and expanded as a flow in a separate diagram that has a child-to-parent relationship to the diagram with the collapse subprocess. And here's what it means. When the sequence flow, the solid arrow, arrives at the collapse subprocess, it immediately continues out of the start event in the child level diagram. And when it reaches an end event of the child level, it immediately resumes on the sequence flow exiting the collapse subprocess in the parent diagram. So the child level thus represents the details of what happens inside the subprocess. Now, BPM as a management discipline asks us to understand and to measure the business from an end-to-end cross-functional process perspective. You all know that. So at the detailed level, this is a lot of steps. Too many, typically, to fit on a single page. But subprocesses let you collapse big chunks of the process into single activities. So your top-level BPMN diagram can depict the end-to-end process on a single page, so you can view it from a high level. In traditional flow charting, we did this by creating a high-level map and a detailed activity flow as separate diagrams, separate models. And when something changed in our model, we needed to change both to keep them in sync. That approach simply doesn't scale when you have a couple dozen processes all being modeled and they're all continually changing. You can't keep them in sync. Hierarchical modeling avoids that problem because there's just a single model supporting both high-level and detailed process views, which must always be in sync by definition. A third difference from traditional flowcharts. BPMN shows in the diagram itself the interactions between a process and things outside the process. Such as what? Such as the customer, such as service providers, such as other processes. Those external entities are represented in the diagram abstractly as what are called black box pools, labeled rectangles that are completely empty, like you see to here, customer and distributor. We don't see their internal process logic. Often we don't know what it is if we're the process provider, but we do see the interactions of two types. The dashed connector is called message flow, a communication pushed by the external entity directly to the process, or possibly the other way around. We also have a data store, the can shape, representing stored information that can be updated and queried by both the external entity and the process. For example, a customer updates the credit card info on their profile, and when an order process needs to access it, it queries the profile. So BPMN provides a way to show how information is exchanged between processes or between a process and a customer or service provider, and shows it right there in the diagram. A fourth difference from flowcharts. BPMN is able to show in the diagram event-triggered behavior. How the process responds, for example, when a customer cancels or modifies an order in process, or when an activity does not complete by a deadline. BPMN's event shape, the circle, shows that behavior. The icon inside the circle, called the trigger, indicates the type of signal involved. The message trigger, indicated by the envelope icon, as you see here, means receipt of a message flow. And depending on the event type and placement in the diagram, the triggered behavior could be creating a new instance of the process, or resuming a paused instance, or terminating a running activity and redirecting the flow, or creating a new parallel thread within a running process without terminating the running activity. So all of these are valuable for exposing exception behavior, again, directly in the process diagram, where it can be reviewed and analyzed by the team, instead of the traditional way, hiding it in the footnotes of some long text document, business requirements, where it cannot be reviewed and shared. So BPMN provides valuable information missing from traditional swim lane flowcharts. Its basic elements are familiar to business people, but it can also express a lot of detailed process behavior, external interactions, event-triggered actions, directly in the diagram, and do it with the semantic precision required, say, by a developer or by a system architect. So we begin to imagine it as the realization of the dream. That dream we always talk about of a common process language, shareable across the whole project team, shareable between business and IT even. That's kind of the impossible dream. And shareable with other teams across the enterprise, both now and in the future, that may know nothing of our immediate project or our process or even our terminology. BPMN, as a language, has the potential to fulfill that dream. But let's go back to reality. Let's return to this diagram that I showed earlier. It has message flows. It has black box pools, events, and subprocesses. Technically, it violates no rules of the BPMN specification. In fact, it's actually taken from the OMG website in a document called BPMN 2.0 by example. But I still call it bad BPMN because it does not communicate the process logic in a clear and meaningful way. You cannot easily see, for example, how the process starts and ends. This process actually has 2 end states, not 4, and they're not labeled. In fact, when you print this diagram on a single page, like you see here, you cannot even read the text. This diagram avoids the hierarchical style. The top process level and the child levels, which are there in what are called expanded subprocesses, are in the same diagram, the same page. So I said BPMN is inherently hierarchical, but the spec does not require you to draw it that way. Nor does it require you even to label anything, or to use message flows, or to use start event triggers, or any number of things that add meaning to the diagram. Using them officially is optional, and that is a big part of the problem. So let's talk about good BPMN, models that fulfill their primary mission, which is communicating the process logic correctly according to the spec, of course, but also clearly so the process logic is unambiguous, obvious, from the printed diagram alone, even to someone unfamiliar with the process or its terminology, or maybe even with the language that you use. Maybe they're in one of your international divisions. And does it completely so that a single glance at the top level diagram reveals immediately how the process starts, what the instance represents, its possible end states, and all its interactions with external entities, and does this consistently. That is, ideally, given the same set of facts about the steps in the process, all modelers should create more or less the same model, or at least the same model structure. Now, the BPMN specification and its rules are concerned only with goal number 1 here. Goals 2, 3, and 4, which are important, require something more. They require a modeling methodology and additional conventions. Let's call them rules that supplement, that go beyond the rules of the spec, in order simply to make the meaning clear and complete from the printed diagram on its own. And my term for those other things is BPMN method and style. So a lot of the BPMN that I see is actually invalid according to the spec itself. But the rule that it breaks is not clearly explained in the specification. The error is based on an incomplete understanding of BPMN's most fundamental concepts, activity and process. These terms actually have a very specific meaning defined by the BPMN to a metamodel. But the narrative of the spec never explains it. Consequently, most books and training on BPMN don't explain it either. And what makes it worse is that these terms are widely used in other parts of BPM where they have a different meaning, a broader meaning. And this causes problems also, as we shall see. In BPMN, an activity is an action. We label it verb object. But it's not just any action. It's restricted to actions performed repeatedly on instances. So it is not an action performed continuously, such as manage X or monitor Y. And similarly, a process in BPMN is a sequence of actions, or possibly a map of various sequences of actions leading from some initial state to some end state. But again, not just any sequence or not just any map, but one performed repeatedly on instances, not performed continuously. And here also is the secret that the spec never mentions. It's obvious to a programmer who develops an automated process in a BPM suite, but it turns out it's surprising news to most BPM practitioners. And here it is. The instance of each activity in a BPMN process must correspond one-to-one with the instance of the process. So for example, a process in which the instance is in order must only contain activities performed per order. Activities performed once a day, once a week, once per supplier of the ordered item, etc., cannot be included in this BPMN process. They must be part of a separate BPMN process. And here's the problem. Because BPM architecture uses these same terms, activity and process, much more loosely. For example, you're probably familiar with the APQC process classification framework. It has a hierarchy of levels. This is a typical sort of BPM architecture framework. Functional areas, sort of at the top level, process groups. And finally, level 3 calls a process. Level 4 calls activities, presumably grouped under the process that contains them. And if you look through the PCF document, Process Classification Framework document, you'll see that many of them, possibly most of the processes listed, are actually functions, actions sort of performed continuously, not repeatedly in instances. But here's one, 862, that is a BPMN process, process expense reimbursements, employee expense reports. So that is performed repeatedly on instances with each expense report. And it lists 5 activities under this process. But only 2 of them, to my view, are BPMN activities in this process. The first one is really 2 activities, because establishing the policies and communicating them to employees do not occur at the same time or frequency. And neither one of those are done with each expense report, so it's definitely not part of this process. Ditto for the second one. Capturing the tax data might be done for each expense report, but reporting it to the government is something done quarterly or annually. 3 and 4 are probably okay, but the 5th one, manage personal accounts, is not even a BPMN activity at all. It's an action performed continuously, not one performed repeatedly on instances. And the bottom line is that in BPMN, there is simply no possible way to connect these 5 activities in a single BPMN process, whether it's this process or any other process, because their instances do not align. To use BPMN correctly, you need to be concretely aware of what the process instance represents. Most BPMN books never talk about this, but it's critical. In fact, good BPMN makes it easy to tell right from the diagram at a glance what the instance represents. And the process start event is what tells you. There are basically only 3 ways a process can start. By far the most common is on external request, that is, a message flow to a message start event, the top diagram. The instance is the start message, an order, a loan application, a customer service request. Every activity in this process must deal with handling that start message, not some other start message, like a different order, a different loan application. A timer start event, the middle diagram, represents a recurring process. It should be labeled with the frequency and/or time of occurrence. And each instance of this represents exactly one of those occurrences. So you could not have a gateway in this quarterly budget process that loops back to deal with things that happen next quarter. That would be another instance of this process. And then the third way is started manually by someone with defined tasks to perform within the process. Not used that much, but and in this case, the diagram does not clearly identify the instance. Understanding what the instance represents is really important, since it determines which activities can be part of this process and which must be in a separate process in BPMN. This issue of instance alignment is actually the leading cause, in my view, of structural errors in BPMN models, even by so-called experts in process modeling. And it occurs quite frequently. Whenever batching of any sort occurs in an end-to-end business process, which is in most real ones. So here we see in this diagram an order-to-cash process in which billing is not once per order. So every activity in the order-to-cash must align with the start message, which is an order, so once per order. But here we see an order-to-cash process in which billing is not done once per order, but it's done once a month, right? So your phone bill works that way. Your credit card transactions work that way. You don't get a separate invoice for every transaction. You get a bill once a month. And there's an accounts receivable process that runs not once an order and not once a month, but once a payment. Payments are approximately once a month, but not exactly. Some months you might skip, some months you might pay twice. It actually runs once a payment. So this actually requires 3 BPMN processes. Once for the instance is an order, once for the instance is monthly occurrence, once the instance is a payment. But because these are all related as part of the same end-to-end business process, these 3 BPMN processes must coexist and coordinate their state with each other by a combination of message flows and data stores, shared data. Now, at this point, you're saying, see, I told you BPMN was too technical. But there's actually nothing technical about this. It's just unfamiliar. And you're probably thinking, maybe I've made this error myself a lot. A big part of the reason is actually the way we collect process information from our subject matter experts. Now, the facilitator's handbook, I'm sure you're all familiar with this, maybe you wrote this, says when you gathering information from your stakeholders, you ask what comes first, what comes next, etc., and you just write it down. Maybe stickies on the wall, some kind of flow chart. And there's no way that instance alignment is thought about in this scenario. In real time, you're just going to write it down, collect all the facts. Turning it into good BPMN comes later, comes afterward. You need to grind up all those facts and reorganize them from the top down. And this is the method part of method and style. It's totally new for most BPM practitioners and business analysts, and difficult because it requires them to think differently about the process logic, more abstractly and top down, whereas information gathering is concrete and bottom up. So in brief, here's the method, very brief. You start by agreeing on the process scope. What is the process? Let's draw a box around it. When it starts, how it starts, which of the three ways, and that also identifies the process instance. Then how it ends, its end state. We're going to label that end state noun adjective, where the noun is usually the instance. For example, if the instance is in order, order complete or order failed. Then, if there are cases where an instance starts but does not reach the normal end state, we're going to list those, such as order rejected, or order canceled. So that's all step one, the scope. In step two, you're going to decompose the process into 10 or possibly fewer buckets. Every possible action in the process, every possible action, is going to be inside one of those buckets. And each of those buckets is going to be a BPMN activity, typically a subprocess, with its instance corresponding one-to-one with the process instance. Buckets not aligned in this way need to go in a separate process. We're going to name this bucket, this activity, verb object. And for each one, if it could end in different ways that affect the activity that comes next, you need to list those end states of the activity, noun, adjective. So step two, which is the hardest part of the method, is just a list of activity names and possibly their end states. We call this the high-level map. It's a list. Step three of the method is turning those lists from steps 1 and 2 into your top-level BPMN diagram. Sounds hard, but it's actually almost trivial, since all of the activities, the gateways, and events that you need are listed for you already from steps 1 and 2. In fact, the information from steps 1 and 2 are so complete that step 3 could be done for you automatically by software, by a tool. And you'll see that in a minute. Step 4 is then creating a child-level diagram for each sub-process in the top-level diagram. And then repeating steps 2 and 3 for the child level. So you need to kind of iterate. And the method sort of envisions here one child level, but this hierarchy is unlimited in its depth. So you can go down to grandchild and great-grandchild level if you have that much detail. Step 5 is adding all the context information. Message flows and black box pools, lanes to indicate the task performers, the data flow. Modelers often do this first up front, but it really slows you down. And more important, it gets in the way of a structurally correct model. All right, so 5 steps. That's the method. That's the method. Now, in principle, you could create a properly structured BPMN model and properly labeled according to the method and style conventions by filling out a questionnaire, sort of structured interview, aligned to the methodology, clicking a button and having the software generate the diagram for you automatically. And one of the tools we use in our training, Process Modeler for Visio from ITP Commerce, actually does this in a method and style wizard. You see sort of step 1 of the wizard here, and if you can read it on your screen, it asks you to name the process and asks you how's the process start, what's the request message if it's an external request, who's it from, that identifies the black box pool, the name of the end state, name the exception end states. That's step 1. You click the little arrow at the bottom, you go on to step 2. And you do this through all 5 steps, and you click create, and it generates the BPMN diagram. It's amazing. It really works. And it's sort of a fabulous thing to have. And it just shows that if you can answer these questions, that there is sort of one way to generate a structurally correct and properly labeled diagram. All right, now good BPMN requires more than proper structure, however. The goal, remember, is communicating the process logic clearly from the diagram. The top diagram here, the one with the red X through it, fails to do this. But if you were to validate this in a BPMN tool that checks it against all the rules in the BPMN spec, you would find no errors. Perfect. No meaning, but no errors. And that is where the style part of method and style comes in. Because to ensure meaning, you need additional rules beyond those of the spec. They're not official rules. I call them style rules. Many of them basically say if some notation element, an icon, marker, label, or message flow, adds meaning to the diagram, use it, even though the spec says it's okay to omit it. The diagram at the bottom here is exactly the same, technically, as the one above it. But it adds those optional elements. And I think you'll agree it communicates a lot more meaning. Now, when method and style began around 2007, at least when I began teaching it, I used to call these style principles best practices. But you know what happens to best practices, right? People feel free to ignore the ones that they don't understand or they don't care about. I had a lot more success when I started calling them style rules, and way, way more success when some BPMN tools began to include the style rules in their validation. So here's that same BPMN diagram that is perfect according to the spec, gives no errors according to the spec rules, but when you validate against the style rules, you see it gives 7 errors. All of these happen to deal with labeling. And not all style rules deal with labeling, but these 7 errors here seem to all deal with labeling. Today, there's 2 tools that I know of that validate against the style rules, Process Modeler for Visio and Signavio, and those are the tools that I use in my training. There might be others that do, because I published the rules in my book, and so other tool vendors are sort of free to implement it themselves. The method and style also adds conventions to flow elements like gateways, the diamond shapes. In BPMN, a gateway does not make a decision. It simply directs the flow based on a data condition. The outgoing sequence flow with a true condition is the one taken. Officially, that condition can test any data known to the instance at that point in the process, but method and style imposes a constraint on that. It assumes that the gateway tests the end state of the activity immediately preceding the gateway. Let me say it again. The method and style assumes that a gateway tests the end state of the activity immediately preceding the gateway. And at first, this seems awfully limiting, but once you get used to it, you'll find that it's really not. The end state of an activity means how did that activity end, successfully or in some exception end state. In the method, we saw how we needed to list the end states of the process and also of any top-level activities that have more than one possible way they could end. Now, in a process or subprocess, method and style asks you to model each distinct end state of a process or subprocess as separate end events, labeled noun adjective, or simply just adjective to indicate the end state. And here's the thing, the number of end events equals the number of distinct end states. If a subprocess has more than one end event, you follow it with a gateway that asks the question, which one did this instance reach? The number of gates, or outgoing sequence flows on the gateway, must match the number of end states. That's a style rule. And there's also a label matching convention as well, as you see in these diagrams. If there are 2 end states and 2 gates, You can either label the gateway as the success end state, followed by a question mark. In the top, top diagram, it says approved question mark, and label the gates yes and no. Or you can simply label each gate with the name of one of the end states, as in the bottom diagram. And if there's more than 2 gates, you need to do it the bottom way. This count matching and label matching are also style rules checked by the BPMN tool. So why do we do this? Label matching conventions like this provide a simple mechanical device for tracing the process logic down from the top level to the child level, and from there down possibly to grandchild or deeper levels, in a way that's meaningful to someone completely unfamiliar with your process or even your terminology. The gateway labels are brief, and their meaning might be unclear, usually is unclear, simply from the top level diagram. But this label matching lets you trace the logic from a gate in the parent level down to an end event in the child level and back from there. And that usually greatly clarifies the meaning. Style rule validation also checks for this label matching, as I mentioned. We said that good BPMN models are complete. And here's what we mean. The top level diagram should give a bird's eye view of the process as a whole. It fits on one page, and it's guaranteed to be consistent with the detailed flows in the child level. We want this top level view to be complete, meaning it reveals at a glance how the process starts, what the instance represents, its possible end states, and all its interactions with external entities. In method and style gives you that. Here, for example, you see that the process starts on external request, start event. An order, that's the start message. So the instance represents an order. Also, it has 2 possible end states, order complete and order canceled, which return messages, order confirmation, order cancellation notice. There are other interactions with the customer if an order item is backordered or the credit card on file does not work. And we also see the shared data interaction for the corrected credit card information. Also messages to and from a service provider, a distributor, if the order item is out of stock. All of this is immediately apparent from this simple top-level diagram. All right, so method and style is a systematic approach to BPMN. It applies a step-by-step methodology to ensure correct and consistent model structure, and it establishes additional rules that make the process logic clear from the printed diagram. So I've gone through that. So how do you learn it? Well, you can learn it from a book. Everything in my BPMN method and style training is in this book. It's in Kindle, it's like pretty inexpensive in different languages. So that's one way. But to really learn it, you need practice that you can't get from a book. So I developed BPMN Pro, Dan mentioned this, as a gamification-based app, e-learning app, that teaches BPMN method and style purely through quiz questions and puzzles like this one. There's no lecture. It's all questions and exercises. 16 questions per module, typically 3 modules per level, and you progress through 10 levels. It's kind of like a game. You lose a heart, a life, if you miss one, and you lose 4 hearts and you need to redo that module. When you finish level 10, you're going to know as much as someone who does the real training, beginning to end. So this app is hosted on my website. It runs in a web browser or an iPad using the Articulate mobile player that you can download for free from the App Store. So there's the link if you're interested in that on the previous page. The link if you're interested in the book. Now, of course, the best way to learn it is with real training using a real BPMN tool. So our standard BPM Essentials, BPMN Method and Style class is 2 full days on site, or the public classes 3 days, 5 hours a day live online, or there's a web on demand that you take at your pace and schedule. So the training includes 60-day use of a BPMN tool, one of the two that I mentioned, Process Modeler for Visio or Signavio, the ones with the style rule validation. And we give 60-day use because that's the time students have to complete the post-class certification, which is based on an online exam, and more important, a mail-in exercise that students must iteratively fix until it's perfect, according to me. I would say that studying for the exam and working through this mail-in exercise iterations is where students really learn it. Certification is optional. You don't have to do it. We have about 1,000 certified out of over 3,000 trained. So you can see the list of certified students on the bpmessentials.com website. You see a clip of that in the lower left, a clip of an in-class exercise in the upper right here. And to be honest, you've already learned a lot of it, however briefly, already in this webcast. So let's recap the basic principles. First, use the available features of the BPMN notation, icons, markers, and labels as much as you can. They're optional according to the spec, but use them as much as you can to add meaning to the diagram. Second, avoid separate high-level and detailed models, which is the traditional approach. Instead, use the hierarchical style, subprocesses, to create one model with high-level and detailed views. 2 views, 1 model. Third, use 10 or fewer activities in each process level so that each one fits on the page. You can read the text and see that whole level from beginning to end easily in the printed diagram. Fourth, the top-level diagram should be complete. That is, it should reveal at a glance how the process starts, the start event, what the instance represents, its possible end states, separate end events labeled properly, and all its interactions with the customer, with service providers, and other processes. Use separate end events in a process or subprocess to distinguish the end states. And label each one, noun, adjective, to indicate the end state. And follow the various label matching conventions of method and style to link the process logic between parent and child levels, to visually link them mechanically through label matching. We discussed the gateway to end state label matching, and there are others as well, including message flows on parent and child levels, and something called error throw catch, error events. So, in sum, that is BPMN method and style. I believe these slides will be made available from ABPMP, but if they're not, send me an email. You see my email address up there, bruce@brsilver.com. You also see web links for BPMN Pro and the BPM Essentials training. Our next live online class, if you're interested, is next week. We have a few spaces available for that, very few, March 24th to 26th from 11 to 4 p.m. U.S. Eastern Time each day. And the one after that is in May. You see the link for registration there. And I have it set, this you want to pay attention to, I have it set up to offer a 15% discount to you, people on this webcast. Simply apply this coupon code ABPMP15 at checkout and it will take 15% off. So I think that's as much commercial as I'm allowed to say in this presentation. So thank you for your attention. And if you have questions, please enter them and I will address them. So Dan, I'll let you take over with that.
Bruce, thank you. Very interesting, very enlightening. We have, first of all, more of a comment than a question, but from Gina Bees, and it's, I consider APQC framework as a file cabinet to store and organize processes. Bruce, could you just spend a couple seconds talking about the APQC?
Sure. So that's a great, I'm glad you brought that up, Gina. And I would say it is kind of it's a file cabinet to store and organize processes. It's a decomposition of the business into really functions. It's part of architecture. So I agree with you. Here's the problem. The problem is that at level 3, APQC calls things processes, and they are not aligned with BPMN processes. And a lot of my classes, the students say, well, this is fine sort of for things that are processes and activities, but we need to organize these, align these, or sort of somehow harmonize this with our APQC because we use that. And it's a problem because many of the level 3 things in APQC are not processes at all in the BPMN sense, but they are sort of at that level. I'd say they're kind of business processes. I mean, the ones that are the ones that are not just capabilities or functions, that is, the ones that are actually actions and not sort of nouns, could be business processes that contain one or more BPMN processes. So the way I have advised my clients to do this is to define sort of a level in between APQC level 3 and BPMN. Call it level 3.5. Assuming that you want to keep APQC and either use it literally or maybe modify it in its own spirit, but add something between APQC level 3 and BPMN, call it level 3.5, which would be BPMN, which would be, call them BPMN processes that would fit in that APQC sort of process, what APQC calls a process. And certainly ignore everything from level 4 on down. I'm not sure there is something below level 4 in APQC. Just use BPMN for that. So you can't actually wire BPMN directly to APQC, but you can define some intermediate level, let's say level 3.5, that harmonizes the two. And people seem satisfied with that. I think it allows them to move forward.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
We have from Michael Lewis, given that we want to make diagrams as clear as possible through markers, why is it your preference to not include an X in an exclusive gateway?
Okay. Yeah, so this is sort of a minor technical point of BPMN spec says a gateway, which is the diamond shape, with no symbol inside and an X symbol inside, mean the same thing. It's called an exclusive database gateway. And it says there's 2 ways to draw it, and they both mean the same thing, but just pick one. Pick one convention and stick with it. Don't mix them. And so I think long ago I picked the one with no symbol inside. In some tools it actually gives a convenient place to put the label, since it's the most convenient, the most common type of gateway. But I think it was kind of the default of the tool that I was using at the time. There's no particular reason. Since then I've added another tool, Signavio, where the X inside is kind of the default. I'm not even sure if they support the one without the X. I've noticed that Europeans seem to like the X and Americans seem to like no X. And honestly, I don't have a real preference. If I expressed a preference in my book, I don't really feel that way. What I really feel like is you need to pick one convention and stick with it. So in my training, I say, so that everybody sees the same thing. I tell people to do it that way. But if you like the X, go ahead and use the X.
Okay. The next question is from Yana Antov. And can you explain again the process expenses reimbursement example and how the different instance types can't be combined in the same process map?
Okay, so I'm going to have to scroll back here. Let me see if I can find that. That was which slide here? Hang on one second. So slide 13. This one. Okay, so here's APTC, the process expense reimbursements. So the instance of this is a real process that you're familiar with if you ever file an expense report. It's done repeatedly on instances. And how does it start? It starts when you submit an expense report. So that means as an external request from you as the employee, as a requester in your accounting department, in your payroll department, approve this and issue you a check, hopefully. And so the instance is an expense report. That's what the start message is. So every activity in this process must be performed once per expense report. So the first one is not done once an expense report. It's done, establishing the policies and limits is done, establishing them is probably every few years, and communicating them is maybe once a year, or sort of when you start employment or something. It's very infrequently, certainly not with each expense report. So the activity exists, actually two different activities, but neither one is part of this process because they're not done per expense report. For the second one, reporting the tax data, presumably to the government, is done quarterly or annually, not per expense report. Number 3, approving the reimbursement. Yes, that's done with each expense report, so that is part of it. Number 4, same thing. It's done processing it. I presume that means issuing the check. Yes, that's done with each expense report. Manage personal accounts. That's not done repeatedly on instances at all. If you said it is, I'd ask you, what is the instance? You say, well, each employee is an instance. Well, when does that instance start? When they become an employee, and it ends when they terminate employment? I mean, that's, I think, stretching the meaning of those terms, instance. So that's why I say, even though these are 5 activities, and 4 of them are BPMN activities, only 2 of them are BPMN activities in this process because of the instance alignment issue.
Okay, now we
Next question.
We have a few questions remaining. Bruce, are you available to continue for just a few more minutes beyond the...
Sure.
Okay. So to the people on the call still, we'll continue for a while, and when Bruce has to essentially sign off, we'll need to stop. Anything that is not answered by that time will be sent to Bruce, and we'll take his answers and send them back out to everyone. We do want to have all of your questions answered. So the next one is from Michael Lewis. Will the new edition of your method and style book be extended to include either CMMN 1.0 or DMN 1.0?
Yeah, so I'm glad you asked that question because it got a little twisted in the intro. So I'm not doing another book on BPMN method and style because that would really depend on a revision to BPMN 2.0, and which has not happened yet, even though it's almost 5 years old. The book that I'm working on is called DMN Method and Style, DMN Decision Management Notation. There's a new standard for what used to be called business rules. Now it's called decision management. Decision modeling notation, I think is DMN stands for. And it has the same issues that BPMN did, which is there's a spec from OMG. It casts the net pretty broadly. It provides no guidance on how to use it, well. It's basically, here's a notation. It has no methodology. It has no principles of sort of good practice. And so I am in the process of developing something similar to method and style using a DMN for decision modeling. So this is modeling sort of networks of related decisions and also decision tables. So if you're in the sort of business rules area, which is a more actually sort of common place where business analysts play than BPM, look for this. Probably second or third quarter this year should be out.
And the next question, going through down the comments, the next question is from Jim Johnson. And we've looked at both process modelers from Visio and Signavio. Do you have a preference, or are they both good for different things?
Yeah, so those are the two tools that have the style rule validation built in. I use both of them. I mean, they're different. So one's an add-in to Visio. So the drawing quality is probably better for complex diagrams, and a little better job on the validation. They have the method wizard, and because it's Visio, you can add all kinds of other shapes to it. What's really good about Signavio, it's cloud-based, so there's nothing to install. That's really nice. It's got a team repository built in, model sharing built in. It has DMN, the decision modeling built in. It's got a bunch of other features built in. So, I'd say they're both good. They're good for different things. They're both excellent tools.
Okay. And running down through my list, Bruce, we have several thank yous, but that completes the questions. If there are any follow-up questions that people have, please send them to Bruce. I'm sure he'll be happy to answer them for you. Or send them to us at ABPMP, and we'll get them to Bruce. If there are no other questions, and none seem to be showing up at this point, I would like to thank you, Bruce. This has been extremely interesting, and I'm sure I speak for everyone.